Racist cop knocks down black woman and faces immediate justice when he learns who she is. Angela Williams hurried down Maple Street, balancing boxes of supplies, unaware that her compassionate mission was about to collide with Officer Michael Reynolds' prejudiced scrutiny. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalks of East Riverton, a neighborhood where hope struggled to bloom amidst concrete and neglect. As she navigated the bustling streets, Angela's mind raced with thoughts of the upcoming charity event at the Riverton Youth Center. The city simmered with tension between law enforcement and the community, a problem she'd dedicated her life to solving. Each step brought her closer to her goal, but also to an unexpected confrontation that would shake the foundations of Riverton. The bell above the door of Patel's grocery chimed as Angela entered, the cool air inside a welcome respite from the humid summer heat. Mr. Patel, a fixture in the community for over 3 decades, looked up from his crossword puzzle and smiled. "Mrs. Williams, always a pleasure to see you," he said, his accent a melodic blend of his Indian roots and years in the American South. Angela set her boxes on the counter. "Mr. Patel, how are you?" "I'm here for the youth center supplies." As Mr. Patel rang up her items, Angela's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, Officer Michael Reynolds patrolled the street, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the faces of passersby. A chill ran down her spine, recognizing the look of suspicion that too often fell on the residents of this predominantly black neighborhood. With her arms full of fresh supplies, Angela stepped back onto the sidewalk. The weight of the boxes was nothing compared to the burden of responsibility she carried for the community's youth. She took a deep breath, savoring the scent of hope mixed with the aroma of Mrs. Johnson's famous peach cobbler wafting from the bakery down the street. Across the road, Jamal Thompson's face lit up as he spotted Angela. The lanky teenager waved enthusiastically, his bright smile a testament to the positive impact of the youth center. But his expression quickly shifted as he noticed Officer Reynolds approaching Angela with purposeful strides. "Ma'am, what's in the boxes?" Officer Reynolds' voice cut through the ambient street noise like a knife. Angela turned, her warm brown eyes meeting the officer's cold blue ones. "Good afternoon, officer. These are just supplies for the youth center event tonight." Reynolds' jaw tightened. "I'm going to need to see some identification and a receipt for those items." The air around them seemed to thicken with tension. Nearby pedestrians slowed their pace, sensing the brewing conflict. Angela's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "Of course, officer. Let me just set these down, and I'll get my ID and receipt for you." As Angela carefully placed the boxes on the ground, Officer Reynolds' hand moved to rest on his holster. The gesture, subtle yet unmistakable, sent a ripple of unease through the gathering onlookers. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Reynolds barked, his posture rigid with suspicion. Angela froze, her hands hovering midair. "Officer, I'm simply trying to comply with your request. There's no need for—" "I said, hands where I can see them." Reynolds' voice rose, drawing more attention from passersby. Across the street, Jamal's fingers flew across his phone screen, dialing a number he'd been given for emergencies. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Ms. Brooks? It's Jamal from the youth center. There's a situation with Mrs. Williams and the police. I think you need to know about this." Back on the sidewalk, Angela's mind raced. She knew her rights, knew she'd done nothing wrong, but also understood the delicate balance required to navigate this situation safely. "Officer Reynolds," she began, her tone measured and clear. "I understand you're doing your job. I'm happy to cooperate fully. May I slowly reach into my purse for my ID and the receipt?" Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "Slowly. Any sudden moves and—" He left the threat unfinished, but its weight hung in the air between them. With deliberate movements, Angela reached for her purse. The world seemed to slow down, each second stretching into eternity. She could feel the eyes of the community upon her, could sense the collective held breath of those watching. As her fingers brushed the clasp of her purse, Reynolds suddenly lunged forward, grabbing her arm with bruising force. "What are you reaching for?" "A weapon." The accusation hung in the air, absurd and infuriating. Angela's supplies scattered across the sidewalk as she stumbled, caught off guard by the officer's aggressive move. "Officer, please! I was only on the ground now," Reynolds shouted, twisting Angela's arm behind her back. The crowd's murmurs turned to shouts of protest. Phones appeared in hands, cameras recording the unfolding injustice. Angela found herself face down on the hot concrete, the rough surface scraping her cheek. "This is unnecessary," she managed to say, her voice strained but still carrying the authority that had made her a pillar of the community. "I am not resisting. I have done nothing wrong." Reynolds' knee pressed into her back as he fumbled for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer and suspected theft." The absurdity of the situation might have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. Angela Williams, respected community leader and wife of the mayor, being treated like a common criminal on the very streets she'd worked tirelessly to improve. From his vantage point across the street, Jamal watched in horror. His fingers shook as he ended the call with Assistant Mayor Karen Brooks, her assurances that help was on the way doing little to calm his racing heart. "This isn't right," Jamal muttered, his young face etched with a mixture of fear and determination. He looked around at the growing crowd, at the faces twisted in anger and disbelief. In that moment, he made a decision that would change the course of the day, and perhaps the future of Riverton itself. Taking a deep breath, Jamal stepped off the curb and into the street. Cars honked as he weaved between them, his eyes fixed on Angela and the officer restraining her. As he approached, he raised his voice, steady despite his fear. "Officer, please! That's Mrs. Williams. She runs the youth center. She's not a thief." Reynolds' head snapped up, his eyes locking onto Jamal with a look that made the young man's blood run cold. "Stay back, kid. This doesn't concern you." But Jamal stood his ground, emboldened by the murmurs of support from the crowd. "It concerns all of us. You're making a mistake." As if on cue, the sky opened up. Fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a downpour that soaked everyone to the bone. The sudden deluge added to the surreal nature of the scene. A respected community leader pinned to the ground, a young man standing up to authority, and a crowd of witnesses getting drenched as they watched justice being perverted before their eyes. The wail of approaching sirens cut through the sound of rain and shouts. Reynolds' backup had arrived, but so had something else. A news helicopter appeared overhead, its rotors beating a rhythm that seemed to match the pounding hearts of those on the ground. As if the situation wasn't chaotic enough, a city bus chose that moment to break down at the intersection, belching smoke and causing traffic to back up. More onlookers poured out of cars and nearby buildings, drawn by the commotion. Detective Lisa Hernandez arrived on the scene, her sharp eyes taking in the details that others might miss. She saw the scattered supplies, the frightened but determined look on Jamal's face, and the way Angela Williams maintained her dignity even while pinned to the wet ground. "Reynolds," Hernandez called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "What's the situation here?" Officer Reynolds looked up, rain streaming down his face. Suspected shoplifter. Resisted arrest. Hernandez's eyes narrowed. Something didn't add up. She'd seen Angela Williams at community events, always working to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. This didn't fit the woman she knew. "Mrs. Williams," Hernandez said, crouching down beside her. "Are you all right?" Angela met the detective's gaze, her eyes clear and unflinching despite the rain and the indignity of her position. "I am unharmed, Detective Hernandez. But this is a grave misunderstanding. I have receipts for everything in those boxes. I was simply on my way to the youth center." Hernandez nodded, a decision forming in her mind. She stood, facing Reynolds. "Let her up, Mike. We need to sort this out properly." Reynolds bristled. "I had it under control." She was reaching for something in her purse. Could have been a weapon. "A weapon," Jamal interjected, his voice cracking with emotion. "Mrs. Williams has never hurt anyone in her life. She's the one who taught us to respect the law, to work with the police." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices rising in a chorus of support for Angela and condemnation for Reynolds' actions. As Hernandez helped Angela to her feet, a commotion at the edge of the crowd drew their attention. Assistant Mayor Karen Brooks pushed her way through, her face a mask of concern and determination. "What in the world is going on here?" Brooks demanded, her eyes widening as she took in Angela's disheveled appearance and the scattered supplies. Before anyone could respond, Brooks's phone rang. She answered, her face paling as she listened to the voice on the other end. With a shaky hand, she lowered the phone and turned to face Officer Reynolds and Detective Hernandez. "That was Mayor Williams," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain and the crowd. "He's on his way here now, and he's demanding to know why his wife is being treated like a criminal." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Officer Reynolds took a step back, the color draining from his face as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Detective Hernandez closed her eyes briefly, understanding that this incident was about to become much bigger than a simple misunderstanding on a rainy afternoon. As the news spread through the crowd, a hush fell over the scene. The only sounds were the patter of rain, the whir of the news helicopter overhead, and the distant wail of more approaching sirens. In that moment of stunned silence, the true weight of what had transpired began to settle on everyone present. Angela Williams stood tall despite her soaked clothes and the lingering indignity of her treatment. She looked at the faces around her, Jamal's youthful determination, Hernandez's dawning comprehension, Reynolds's growing fear, and the mix of anger and hope in the eyes of her community. In that moment, as the rain washed over them all, Angela knew that this was more than just a personal injustice. It was a catalyst, a moment that would force Riverton to confront the deep-seated issues that had long simmered beneath the surface. And as she heard the approaching footsteps of her husband, Mayor Thomas Williams, Angela steeled herself for the storm that was about to break, not just over Riverton, but over the entire nation. The rain pelted down mercilessly, turning Maple Street into a shimmering mirror of chaos. Officer Reynolds' face contorted with a mixture of anger and uncertainty as he tightened his grip on Angela's arm. The growing crowd, their faces a mosaic of shock and indignation, pressed closer, their voices rising above the steady drumbeat of the downpour. "This is your last warning," Reynolds shouted, his free hand hovering near his holster. "Back up, or I'll have you all arrested for obstructing justice." Angela winced as the officer's fingers dug into her flesh, but her voice remained steady. "Officer, please. This is unnecessary. I've done nothing wrong, and I'm willing to cooperate fully." From the edge of the crowd, Jamal's eyes darted between Angela and the approaching police cars, their sirens wailing in harmony with the helicopters circling overhead. His heart raced as he realized the situation was spiraling out of control. Detective Lisa Hernandez stepped out of her unmarked car, her keen eyes taking in the scene before her. She responded to Reynolds' call for backup, but something about this didn't sit right. As she approached, she could feel the tension crackling in the air like static electricity. "Reynolds," she called out, her voice cutting through the cacophony. "What's the situation here?" Officer Reynolds turned, relief washing over his face at the sight of a fellow officer. "Suspected shoplifter, resisting arrest." The crowd's getting unruly. Hernandez's gaze shifted to Angela, noting her composed demeanor despite the circumstances. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Before Angela could respond, Reynolds interjected, "She's fine. Just being difficult." Hernandez raised an eyebrow, her instincts telling her there was more to this story. "Let's all take a breath here. Mrs. Williams," Angela supplied, her eyes meeting Hernandez's. "Angela Williams. I run the youth center down the street. This is all a misunderstanding." Recognition flickered across Hernandez's face. She'd seen Angela at community events, always working to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. This didn't add up. As Hernandez opened her mouth to speak, a commotion from the crowd drew their attention. A group of young men, faces twisted with anger, surged forward. "Let her go," one shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "You can't treat people like this." Reynolds' body tensed, his hand moving to his weapon. "Stay back," he barked, panic edging into his voice. Hernandez stepped between the officer and the advancing group, her hands raised. "Everyone, please. We need to calm down and sort this out." The tension in the air was palpable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. And then, as if the universe itself decided to add to the chaos, the sky opened up further. The steady rain transformed into a torrential downpour, drenching everyone to the bone in seconds. Through the curtain of rain, Jamal spotted a familiar face pushing through the crowd. Assistant Mayor Karen Brooks, her usually impeccable suit now clinging to her frame, made her way to the front lines. "What in God's name is going on here?" Brooks demanded, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. Reynolds, still gripping Angela's arm, turned to face the new arrival. "Ma'am, this is a police matter. I'm going to have to ask you to step back." Brooks's eyes narrowed. "I'm Assistant Mayor Karen Brooks, and I demand to know why Mrs. Williams is being treated like a common criminal." The revelation sent a ripple through the crowd. Murmurs of disbelief and outrage grew louder, mixing with the sound of rain and sirens. Hernandez, sensing the situation teetering on the brink, stepped forward. "Officer Reynolds, I think we need to reassess this situation. Mrs. Williams, would you be willing to come with me to sort this out somewhere drier?" Before Angela could respond, Reynolds' frustration boiled over. With a sudden move, he shoved Angela forward, causing her to lose her footing on the slick pavement. She fell hard, crying out as her wrist twisted beneath her. The crowd erupted. Shouts of anger and dismay filled the air as people surged forward, held back only by the thin line of newly arrived officers. Hernandez rushed to Angela's side, helping her to her feet. "Are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" Angela cradled her wrist, pain etched across her face. I think it might be sprained." Turning to Reynolds, Hernandez's voice was steel. "What the hell was that, Mike? This is completely out of line." Reynolds' face flushed red, a vein pulsing in his forehead. "She was resisting. I had to subdue her." "Resisting?" Jamal's voice cut through the chaos. He pushed his way to the front, phone in hand. "I've got it all on video. Mrs. Williams didn't do anything wrong." As if on cue, the whir of helicopter blades grew louder. A news chopper descended, its spotlight illuminating the scene in harsh, unforgiving light. Assistant Mayor Brooks, her face a mask of barely contained fury, pulled out her phone. "This ends now. I'm calling the mayor." The mention of the mayor sent a jolt through Reynolds. For the first time, doubt crept into his eyes. "The mayor? What's he got to do with this?" Brooks's voice was ice as she dialed. "Everything, Officer Reynolds. Absolutely everything." As Brooks spoke in hushed tones on the phone, Hernandez guided Angela to the side, away from Reynolds' reach. "Mrs. Williams, I apologize for this treatment. We'll get this sorted out, I promise." Angela nodded, her composure remarkable despite the circumstances. "Thank you, Detective. But it's not just about me. This is about a systemic problem that needs addressing." Hernandez nodded, a mix of admiration and shame washing over her. Here was a woman who, even in the face of injustice, was thinking about the picture. The crowd's chants grew louder, more organized. "No justice, no peace." They rhythmically called out, their voices rising above the storm. Reynolds, his face a storm cloud of emotions, barked into his radio. "Dispatch, we need crowd control here. This is turning into a riot." Hernandez shot him a warning look. "Don't escalate this, Mike. We need to de-escalate." But it was too late. The arrival of more police vehicles, their lights painting the rain-slicked streets in flashes of red and blue, only served to heighten the tension. From the edge of the crowd, a new voice rose. "What's going on here? Let me through." The sea of people parted, revealing Mayor Thomas Williams, his suit disheveled and his eyes wild with concern. As he took in the scene, his wife cradling her injured wrist, the aggressive stance of Officer Reynolds, the angry crowd, his face hardened into a mask of controlled fury. "Someone better start explaining," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his office, and explaining fast. The mayor's arrival should have been the turning point, the moment when reason prevailed. But Officer Reynolds, pushed to his breaking point by the pressure and his own prejudices, made a fateful decision. "She's under arrest," he declared, moving towards Angela with handcuffs at the ready. "And anyone who interferes will be too." Mayor Williams stepped forward, his voice rising. "Officers, stand down. That's my wife, you're." But his words were drowned out by a sudden commotion. A scuffle broke out at the edge of the crowd as an overzealous officer shoved a protester. Like a spark to dry tinder, the situation exploded. Shouts filled the air as people pushed and shoved. The line of officers broke, and chaos reigned. Through the madness, Reynolds grabbed Angela's arm, dragging her towards a waiting patrol car. "Thomas!" Angela called out, her voice barely audible above the din. The mayor tried to push through the surging crowd, but it was like swimming against a tide. He watched, helpless, as Reynolds shoved Angela into the back of the police car. "Stop!" Mayor Williams shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'm the mayor. That's my wife." But his words were lost in the chaos. The patrol car's door slammed shut, and it began to pull away, sirens wailing. Detective Hernandez, caught in the middle of the melee, locked eyes with the mayor. In that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. This was no longer just about one incident or one arrest. This was a powder keg of long-simmering tensions, finally exploding. As the patrol car disappeared around a corner, carrying Angela away from the scene, Mayor Williams turned to Hernandez, his voice low and intense. "Detective, I need your help. We need to make this right, not just for Angela, but for the entire city." Hernandez nodded, her mind already racing with the implications. "I'll do whatever I can, Mr. Mayor. But first, we need to get control of this situation before someone gets seriously hurt." As if to punctuate her words, the sound of breaking glass echoed from down the street. The protests were spreading, fueled by years of frustration and the raw injustice they'd just witnessed. Mayor Williams squared his shoulders, the weight of the city's future heavy upon them. "Then let's get to work, detective. We've got a long night ahead of us." As they moved to address the crowd, the rain continued to fall, washing away the last vestiges of a peaceful afternoon in Riverton. The city stood on the brink of change, teetering between chaos and hope. And somewhere in the back of a police car, Angela Williams sat in silence, her mind already formulating a plan to turn this moment of injustice into a catalyst for real, lasting change. The night was far from over, and the true battle for Riverton's soul was just beginning. The rain-slicked streets of Riverton reflected the flashing blue and red lights of police cruisers, creating a dizzying kaleidoscope of color. The air crackled with tension as protesters and police faced off, their shouts rising above the steady drumbeat of the downpour. At the center of the maelstrom, Detective Lisa Hernandez's mind raced. She'd seen her share of tense situations, but this was different. The arrest of Angela Williams had struck a nerve, igniting long-simmering frustrations within the community. Hernandez's phone buzzed in her pocket. She ducked behind a police van, shielding the screen from the rain. "Hernandez," she answered, her voice taut. "Lisa, it's David O'Connor," came the gruff response. "What the hell is going on down there?" Sergeant David O'Connor, a veteran officer known for his level head and community ties, was one of the few people Hernandez truly trusted on the force. "It's a mess, David," she replied, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Reynolds arrested Angela Williams on some bogus shoplifting charge. Now it's snowballed into this." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When O'Connor spoke again, his voice was low and urgent. "Lisa, listen to me carefully. Angela Williams isn't just some random citizen. She's the mayor's wife." The revelation hit Hernandez like a punch to the gut. Suddenly, Reynolds' overzealous actions took on a whole new dimension. "Christ," she muttered. "No wonder this thing's exploding. What do we do?" "De-escalate," O'Connor said firmly. "Get Angela out of there if you can. And for God's sake, keep Reynolds away from her. That hothead's liable to make things even worse." As if on cue, a commotion erupted near the police line. Hernandez's head snapped up, her eyes widening as she saw Officer Reynolds shoving his way through the crowd, dragging a handcuffed Angela Williams behind him. "Gotta go," Hernandez said quickly, ending the call and pushing her way towards the unfolding scene. Reynolds' face was a mask of barely contained rage as he manhandled Angela towards a waiting patrol car. "You're going downtown," he snarled. "Maybe a night in lockup will teach you some respect." Angela's calm demeanor had finally cracked, her eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and indignation. "This is absurd," she protested. "You have no right." Her words were cut short as Reynolds roughly shoved her into the back of the cruiser. The crowd's angry shouts intensified, the tension ratcheting up to a fever pitch. Hernandez reached the car just as Reynolds slammed the door shut. "Reynolds, what the hell are you doing?" she demanded. "This situation is volatile enough without." "Stay out of this, Hernandez," Reynolds snapped. "I'm handling it." Before Hernandez could respond, a new voice cut through the chaos. "Let her go. That's my wife." Mayor Thomas Williams pushed his way through the crowd, his usually impeccable suit disheveled, his face a storm cloud of fury and concern. The sight of the mayor seemed to jolt Reynolds, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. But it was too late. The damage was done. As the mayor reached the police line, an overzealous officer, misreading the situation, roughly shoved him back. It was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The crowd surged forward, their angry shouts turning into a roar of outrage. Officers, caught off guard by the sudden onslaught, fumbled for their riot gear. In the confusion, Reynolds made a split-second decision. He jumped into the driver's seat of the patrol car and peeled away from the curb, tires screeching on the wet pavement. Angela Williams, still handcuffed in the back seat, was whisked away from the scene. "No!" Mayor Williams cried out, his voice lost in the cacophony of the riot now erupting around them. Hernandez watched in horror as the situation spiraled out of control. Protesters clashed with police, the sound of breaking glass punctuating the air. Tear gas canisters arced through the rain-filled sky, their acrid smoke mixing with the downpour to create a hellish fog. Through the chaos, Hernandez locked eyes with the mayor. In that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. This was no longer just about one arrest or one incident. This was a city on the brink, years of mistrust and injustice finally boiling over. "Detective," Mayor Williams said, his voice strained but determined. "We need to fix this. Not just for Angela, but for all of Riverton." Hernandez nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "I'll do whatever I can, Mr. Mayor. But first, we need to find your wife and get her to safety." As if in response to her words, Hernandez's phone buzzed again. It was a text from Sergeant O'Connor. Reynolds just radioed in. "He's taking Angela to the station. Meet me there ASAP." Hernandez quickly relayed the information to the mayor. "We need to move fast," she said. "If we can get to the station before Reynolds files any charges, we might be able to contain this." Mayor Williams nodded grimly. "Let's go. I'll call Chief Miller on the way. He needs to know what's happening." As they pushed their way through the crowd towards Hernandez's unmarked car, the detective couldn't shake the feeling that this night was far from over. The city of Riverton was balanced on a knife's edge, and the next few hours would determine whether it fell into chaos or found a path toward healing. Across town, at the Riverton police station, Angela Williams sat in a holding cell, her wrist throbbing where the handcuffs had dug into her skin. The cold metal bench beneath her was a stark contrast to the warmth and comfort she'd known just hours before. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath to center herself. In her mind, she could still hear the angry shouts of the protesters, could still see the look of helpless rage on her husband's face as Officer Reynolds had driven her away. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped her back to the present. She looked up to see Officer Reynolds standing outside the cell, a triumphant smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Comfortable, Mrs. Williams?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "Don't worry, you'll have plenty of time to get used to it. I'm drawing up the charges now. Resisting arrest, assaulting an officer. I might even throw in inciting a riot for good measure." Angela met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "We both know those charges are false, Officer Reynolds. This vendetta of yours isn't just against me. It's against an entire community that's tired of being treated like criminals in their own neighborhood." Reynolds' smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. "You people always play the victim, don't you? Never taking responsibility for your actions." "And what actions would those be?" Angela asked calmly. "Buying supplies for a youth center? Trying to make our community a better place?" Or is it simply existing while black that offends you so much? Reynolds's face flushed red, his hand clenching into a fist at his side. For a moment, Angela thought he might actually strike her through the bars of the cell. But before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Reynolds." Both Angela and Reynolds turned to see Sergeant David O'Connor striding down the hallway, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Sergeant," Reynolds stammered, caught off guard. "I was just—" "Save it," O'Connor snapped. "I want you in my office. Now." As Reynolds slunk away, O'Connor turned to Angela, his expression softening. "Mrs. Williams, I can't begin to apologize for what you've been through tonight. We're going to get this sorted out, I promise you." Angela nodded, a glimmer of hope rising in her chest. "Thank you, Sergeant. But it's not just about me. What happened tonight, it's symptomatic of a much larger problem." O'Connor's eyes met hers, a look of understanding passing between them. "I know," he said quietly, "and it's long past time we addressed it." Before he could say more, the sound of raised voices echoed from the front of the station. Angela recognized one of them immediately, Thomas. Moments later, Mayor Thomas Williams burst into the holding area, flanked by Detective Hernandez and Chief Robert Miller. The sight of Angela behind bars seemed to physically pain him. "Angela," he breathed, rushing to the cell. "Are you all right? Did they hurt you?" She reached through the bars, taking his hand in hers. "I'm okay, Thomas, but we have work to do." Chief Miller stepped forward, his face a mixture of embarrassment and determination. "Mrs. Williams, please accept my deepest apologies for this incident. I assure you, there will be a full investigation." "With all due respect, Chief," Angela replied, her voice firm, "an investigation isn't enough. What happened tonight is the result of years of systemic issues within the department and the city as a whole. We need real, lasting change." The chief nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. "You're right, of course, but where do we even begin?" It was Jamal Thompson who answered, his young voice carrying down the hallway as he approached, flanked by a group of community leaders and activists. "We begin by listening," Jamal said, his eyes meeting Angela's through the cell bars. "By acknowledging the pain and frustration that's been building for years. And then we work together, police, city officials, and community members, to build a Riverton that works for everyone." The hallway fell silent as the weight of Jamal's words sank in. It was Angela who finally broke the silence, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Well said, Jamal," she said softly. "I couldn't have put it better myself." As Chief Miller moved to unlock the cell door, freeing Angela from her unjust confinement, a sense of cautious hope began to fill the room. The night had been long and painful, but perhaps from this crucible of conflict, something positive could emerge. Outside the police station, the rain had finally stopped. The first rays of dawn were beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was a new day for Riverton, a day that held both challenges and opportunities. As Angela stepped out of the station, her hand clasped tightly in Thomas's, she knew that the real work was just beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, it felt like real change might be possible. The city of Riverton stood at a crossroads, poised between the shadows of its past and the promise of a brighter future. And as Angela Williams looked out at the gathering crowd of supporters and concerned citizens, she knew that the choice of which path to take belonged to all of them. The dawn of a new era was breaking over Riverton. It remained to be seen what that era would bring, but one thing was certain. The voices that had been silenced for so long were finally being heard, and they had no intention of falling silent again. The fluorescent lights of the Riverton police station buzzed overhead as Angela Williams sat in the holding cell, her wrist throbbing where the handcuffs had dug into her skin. The cold metal bench beneath her was a stark contrast to the warmth she'd known just hours before at the youth center. She closed her eyes, centering herself with a deep breath. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped her back to reality. Officer Michael Reynolds appeared, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. "Comfortable, Mrs. Williams?" His voice dripped with false concern. "Don't worry. You'll have plenty of time to get used to it." I'm drawing up the charges now. Resisting arrest, assaulting an officer. I might even throw in inciting a riot for good measure. Angela met his gaze, her voice steady. We both know those charges are false, Officer Reynolds. This vendetta isn't just against me. It's against an entire community tired of being treated like criminals in their own neighborhood. Reynolds' smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. You people always play the victim, don't you? Never taking responsibility for your actions. And what actions would those be? Angela asked, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Reynolds' growing agitation. Buying supplies for a youth center? Trying to make our community a better place? Or is it simply existing while black that offends you so much? Reynolds' face flushed red, his hand clenching into a fist at his side. For a moment, Angela thought he might actually strike her through the bars of the cell. But before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. That's enough, Reynolds. Both turned to see Sergeant David O'Connor striding down the hallway, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Sergeant, Reynolds stammered, caught off guard. I was just... Save it, O'Connor snapped. I want you in my office. Now. As Reynolds slunk away, O'Connor turned to Angela, his expression softening. Mrs. Williams, I can't begin to apologize for what you've been through tonight. We're going to get this sorted out. I promise you. Before Angela could respond, the sound of raised voices echoed from the front of the station. She recognized one immediately, Thomas. Moments later, Mayor Thomas Williams burst into the holding area, flanked by Detective Lisa Hernandez and Chief Robert Miller. The sight of Angela behind bars seemed to physically pain him. Angela, he breathed, rushing to the cell. Are you all right? Did they hurt you? She reached through the bars, taking his hand in hers. I'm okay, Thomas, but we have work to do. Chief Miller stepped forward, his face a mixture of embarrassment and determination. Mrs. Williams, please accept my deepest apologies for this incident. I assure you, there will be a full investigation. With all due respect, Chief, Angela replied, her voice firm. An investigation isn't enough. What happened tonight is the result of years of systemic issues within the department and the city as a whole. We need real, lasting change. As Chief Miller moved to unlock the cell door, freeing Angela from her unjust confinement, a sense of cautious hope began to fill the room. The night had been long and painful, but perhaps from this crucible of conflict, something positive could emerge. Over the next few weeks, Riverton became a city transformed. The incident with Angela Williams had sparked a movement, igniting long-simmering frustrations and demanding change. Detective Lisa Hernandez, true to her word, launched a thorough internal investigation into the police department's practices. What she uncovered was more shocking than anyone had anticipated. In a dimly lit conference room at City Hall, Hernandez laid out her findings to Mayor Williams, Chief Miller, and Councilwoman Patricia Green. The air was thick with tension as she spoke. It's not just isolated incidents of misconduct, Hernandez explained, her voice heavy with the weight of her discoveries. There's a systemic problem within the department. A group of officers, including Reynolds, have been manipulating crime statistics to justify aggressive policing in minority neighborhoods. Chief Miller's face paled. How deep does this go? Hernandez met his gaze steadily. Deep enough that we're going to need to make sweeping changes. This isn't just about a few bad apples. The entire orchard needs tending. Councilwoman Green leaned forward, her eyes blazing with determination. Then that's exactly what we'll do. It's time for Riverton to face its demons and come out stronger on the other side. As the meeting adjourned, Mayor Williams pulled Hernandez aside. Thank you for your integrity, Detective. I know this couldn't have been easy. Hernandez nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't, but it was necessary. Your wife's courage inspired a lot of us to look harder at the problems we've been ignoring for too long. Across town, at the Riverton Youth Center, Angela Williams stood before a packed room of community members, activists, and concerned citizens. The energy in the air was electric, a mixture of anger, hope, and determination. What happened to me was not an isolated incident, Angela began, her voice strong and clear. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. But tonight, we're here to talk about solutions. As she spoke, outlining plans for community oversight of the police department, increased funding for youth programs, and initiatives to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served, the crowd listened with rapt attention. In the back of the room, Jamal Thompson watched with pride. He'd spent the past weeks organizing this meeting, bringing together voices from all corners of Riverton. As Angela's words washed over the crowd, he could feel the spark of change igniting in the hearts of those around him. Meanwhile, in a small office at the police station, Officer Michael Reynolds sat across from Sergeant David O'Connor. The weight of his actions and the revelations of the investigation had taken their toll. Reynolds looked older, his arrogance replaced by a haunted expression. "I never meant for it to go this far," Reynolds said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was doing the right thing, keeping the city safe." O'Connor leaned forward, his eyes filled with a mixture of disappointment and compassion. "The road to hell is paved with good intentions, Mike. But it's not too late to make things right. The department is changing. You can be part of that change, or you can fight it. The choice is yours." Reynolds nodded slowly, the full impact of his actions finally sinking in. "I want to make it right. I don't know how, but I want to try." As the weeks turned into months, Riverton began to heal. The police department underwent a massive overhaul, with new training programs focused on de-escalation and community relations. Officer Reynolds, true to his word, became an advocate for change within the force, sharing his story as a cautionary tale to new recruits. Detective Hernandez's investigation led to several high-ranking officers being removed from their positions, making way for a new generation of leadership committed to fair and just policing. Sergeant O'Connor took on a more prominent role, working closely with community leaders to rebuild trust. At the youth center, Angela Williams continued her work with renewed vigor. The incident that had nearly broken her had instead galvanized her resolve. She worked tirelessly, expanding programs and reaching out to at-risk youth who had previously fallen through the cracks. One sunny afternoon, as Angela was preparing for a new after-school program, a familiar face appeared in the doorway of her office. "Mrs. Williams?" Jamal Thompson stood there, a nervous smile on his face. "Do you have a minute?" Angela's face lit up. "For you, Jamal. Always. Come in." As Jamal sat down, she could see the change in him. The scared teenager who had witnessed her arrest had grown into a confident young man, his eyes shining with purpose. "I wanted to thank you," Jamal began. "What happened that night, it opened my eyes, made me realize that change doesn't just happen. We have to make it happen." Angela nodded, a surge of pride welling up in her chest. "And what are you going to do with that realization, Jamal?" He sat up straighter, his voice filled with determination. "I'm applying to law school. I want to become a civil rights attorney. I want to fight for people who can't fight for themselves." Tears pricked at the corners of Angela's eyes. She reached across the desk, taking Jamal's hand in hers. "Jamal, I couldn't be prouder. You're going to change lives." As Jamal left her office, Angela stood at the window, watching the bustling street outside. Riverton was far from perfect, but it was changing. The incident that had threatened to tear the city apart had instead become a catalyst for growth and healing. Later that evening, as the sun began to set over Riverton, Angela stood on a makeshift stage in the park across from the youth center. A crowd had gathered, faces both familiar and new, all united in their hope for a better future. As she stepped up to the microphone, Angela took a moment to look out at the sea of faces before her. She saw Detective Hernandez and Sergeant O'Connor standing side by side, their presence a symbol of the new partnership between the police and the community. She saw Councilwoman Green, her face beaming with pride at the changes they'd accomplished. And in the front row, she saw Thomas, her rock through it all, and Jamal, the embodiment of Riverton's bright future. They tried to silence one voice, Angela began, her words carrying across the hushed crowd. But they awakened a chorus that will not be ignored. "What happened to me was painful, but from that pain, we've found strength. We've found unity. And most importantly, we've found hope." As applause erupted from the crowd, Angela felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The journey had been long and difficult, but standing there, surrounded by the community she loved, she knew it had been worth it. Riverton had faced its demons and emerged stronger. There was still work to be done, challenges to overcome, but for the first time in years, the future looked bright. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of hope, Angela Williams knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for her city, a chapter of healing, growth, and unity. The chorus that had been awakened would continue to sing, its melody a testament to the power of one voice to change a community, and the strength of a community united in pursuit of justice and equality.